Hello, my lovelies, and welcome to Based AS. I'm departing from my usual format this week to bring you an interview with Helen Rollins, filmmaker and author of the newly released Psychocinema. We took the opportunity to talk about capitalism and desire, and the way that she argues film can potentially undermine the logic of capitalism, lay bare both its empty promises and our relations with each other. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to keep more coming, go to www.patreon.com/Ashley A. Frawley.
I'm Helen Rollins, is my surname, I guess, and I am a filmmaker, and I'm also interested in psychoanalysis and philosophy and politics a bit. Ashley and I know each other from Sublation. I help edit the magazine with my husband, Alfie. And I've just written, or I wrote a while ago, but it takes a while for the book to actually see the light of day. So a book I've just written is out. It's called Psychocinema. Ta-da. And it is a sort of rethinking of what psychoanalytic film is and could be in the light of the fact that the forms of thinking about film in relation to psychoanalysis that are really dominant, both in sort of film studies at universities and in the practice of making films, especially in Europe, in terms of the economic model that exists here and is also sort of spreading throughout the world, which we can talk about. I'm sure we'll get onto a sort of state-sponsored trickle-down economics that we're sort of seeing emerge, and the way that psychoanalysis has been sort of handled and mishandled has become sort of an ideological foil for this new form of economy. And what I really wanted to point out in this book is that this set of ideas really is not very psychoanalytic, and it sort of thinks about how certain terms which came into common use. And this is not to say, by the way, that there's plenty of people doing really brilliant work related to film and psychoanalysis and literary studies and all this kind of stuff inside and outside of the university. It just happens to be a set of ideas that have dominated probably most especially on the production front. And I would say it's kind of tragic, or at least interesting and commentable upon, that what has come to dominate in the name of thinkers like Lacan. If we trace back some of these terms like gaze, G-A-Z-E, to what Lacan was writing about, the ideas that have come to dominate film culture and film practice are quite far from the original concepts. So thinking about, and it's sort of a tragedy because in the name of someone like Lacan, we have a sort of confidence of what these ideas are. And in fact, in reality, those ideas are much more universal, contradictory, and quite kind of explosive in terms of how we relate to commodities, each other, art itself. And if those ideas have been neutered by an appropriation of the terminology in a different direction, we're tragically missing a whole set of ways that we can reflect upon film, a set of ways we can think about making film and watching film. And I sort of therefore think about what Lacanian film is and might be. And I guess the main argument is that instead of psychoanalysis, and I say quote, use these quote marks because it's not really what psychoanalysis is about, to sort of delve into the depths of someone's mind and work out what they were really thinking. That's not really, that's sort of a misunderstanding. So the idea is that cinema could be almost a technology like that of psychoanalysis itself, the encounter in the clinic, whereby film becomes a mode through which we can encounter the divided nature of subjectivity itself. So instead of psychoanalysis being a way to help us think about what the film represents or what was going on in the mind of the director at the time or something like that, even though, okay, that's maybe sort of an unfair assessment of what psychoanalytic film theory is currently, but you do see flavors of this everywhere. But rather perhaps a Lacanian way of thinking about film is that film is a confrontation with the lack in our subjectivity and is analogous to the practice of psychoanalysis itself. So even though the book does take as example various films to study and maybe to reflect upon in a psychoanalytic way, that the overall argument is to show how film itself is the psychoanalysis rather than psychoanalysis being the thing that's, yeah.
So there's so much in that I want to go into. And actually, I wanted to dive right into kind of that main argument, this idea that film, the way that film acts on subjectivity, and this idea of the divided subject. But I was curious while you were speaking about this idea of, correcting or combating a really maybe watered down or neutered version of Lacan or of film analysis that you might get in university, because it reminded me quite a lot of Marxism. That when you come out of your undergrad, you get a really neutered version of Marxism. And then you actually go and read Marx and engage with him. And then now you have to spend all this time combating all of that misunderstanding. Exactly. So I was really curious, what exactly, if I were to go into film studies now, or I'm not really sure, obviously I studied sociology and anthropology, so it's totally out of my domain. But, courses that deal with this, what would people learn and how is it misguided? Psychocinema by Helen Rollins, page 110. Many critics, perhaps fearful of losing their footing in a precarious landscape, read works not according to the artistic qualities of their manifest content, but according to the work's ideological adherence to culturally accepted points of view or the identity of those who made it. Thus, much of film culture has missed the political possibility of the encounter with the novelty of lack in film. At a time of immense economic precarity, and with the ever-present threat of the trauma of finally accepting the failures of the system in which we are all so deeply, unconsciously invested, a repression of the productive lack in film as art form acts as a soothing fetish to protect ourselves from the truth of our reality, to which lack would orient us. Similar to the philanthropic drive amongst robber barons during the early 20th century monopoly capitalism, the immoral workings of corporate oligopoly have demanded an appeal to moralism, to both mystify its functioning and to drive a wedge between different population groups who would have a greater sway if they collaborated according to the universal logic of lack and recognized their shared interest. Impecunious graduates are able to sustain a fantasy relationship to the tragedy of their impoverishment precisely by their debt-inducing neoliberal education, by adhering to the moral logic of the university discourse that sets them apart, consciously at least, from the proletariat, to which monetarily they have, in fact, become aligned. The university discourse may claim to know in advance the direction of political change, but it is in fact an aesthetic, apolitical, and utopian logic, as evidenced in its disciplinary dynamic and its impulse to fetishize the other according to the conservative promise of Orientalism. Whilst the university discourse confidently pre-codes the contours of a revolution that may never come, the analyst discourse remains open to the surprise of potentiality within the political space. Whilst well-meaning activists may nominate a given group with transcendent promise, absolving themselves of political responsibility in the process, past revolutions have shown that transformation can occur in the most unexpected of places.
So it is really interesting what you say about Marxism, and I thought we'd probably get into it at some stage, because it's absolutely the case that if you return to Marx and you think, even if you read something like the Communist Manifesto, it's mostly a sort of defense against a misunderstanding of what Marxism is, because it's so easily misunderstood and misinterpreted. And I think the ways in which these theories get neutered in this day and age is sort of worse than ever, precisely because we are so engendered in sort of a bourgeois consciousness, a capitalist consciousness, that these original writers were writing against. And in the book, I talk about the idea of cinema as unconsciousness raising rather than consciousness raising. And obviously consciousness raising is this sort of idea that there is a right way in a manifest social system, which potentially is true that there is a correct way, but the ways in which writers critical of capitalism are writing are looking at underlying dynamics like Marx himself. And in terms of psychoanalysis, this is subjectivity. Subjectivity is of interest to the critique of capitalism insofar as capitalism can be read as a response or an outgrowth or a deviation of the way that subjectivity is deviated. So psychoanalysis is interested in, coming from Hegel, the ontology of lack. So how human subjectivity, and in Hegel, it is the universe itself, but subjectivity, so the universe itself for Hegel is born out of contradiction, lack, basically. And for psychoanalysis, it's interested in how humans come to self-consciousness, which for someone like Alenka Zupancic, a really great contemporary Lacanian thinker, is the ticks and the human subjectivities is the ticks and grimaces of the universe. So it's the dividedness of the universe witnessing itself. So psychoanalysis shows us how subjectivity is engendered from less than nothing, as in it's the lack itself that generates the more than nothing and the experience of subjectivity. I mean, we can get into how that, logically occurs in psychoanalysis, and this is delineated in the book. But we are marked as human subjects with a sense of irreparable loss. And I can go into how this actually materially happens, because I think there's a sort of also a misunderstanding that psychoanalysis is kind of woo-woo or really an idealist kind of thing rather than a materialist thing. But actually it's a materialism of the unconscious. So it explicates how materially, basically, it's to do with, at bottom, the size of the child bearer's hips and the child of the baby's head, how this generates this sort of issue. But we are left with a sense of lack, of missing something, and a constant transcendent desire, or a desire to constantly transcend this. And this is how religions respond to our sense of subjective destitution. Confessional religions often in the past have had theological practices that mitigate against the worst excesses of this drive towards a misguided possibility for subjective assuagement. And obviously today we are missing that because we are so atheist and God doesn't exist or whatever. But as Nietzsche pointed out, the Buddha dies, but his shadow is cast on a cave wall for 1,000 years. For Lacan, God is unconscious. We are even more religious now than we ever were, because the religious impulse comes from the structure of subjectivity itself. Capitalism, from this sort of Freudo-Marxist or Lacanian perspective, is a response to that drive for subjective assuagement. So each commodity, even though we can consciously know that it's just a pair of trainers, we reach for it in part to assuage the sense of lack, that there is going to be something more than just the material object that can assuage this sense of bereft. But it's not just the commodity itself, it's all the structures of capitalism that we buy into, most especially just generally the ideology of promise. So the way that, we can talk about maybe this is a subject I know that you're really interested in, but the bourgeois subject, and most especially like the lumpen bourgeois subject, how capitalism extracts almost the most from, there's different positions in capitalism. I don't want to say that the lumpen bourgeois subject is more exploited than a worker, but there is a sense where that subject is not even transcended to this, ascended to the status of a worker in order to be exploited. So you have the likes of students doing huge amounts of unpaid work, getting into huge amounts of debt on the promise that there will be a position for them in society. And obviously we have a massive crisis now because we do not have, because of various issues. I mean, we can get into this in terms of the economy, but the collapsing rate of global profit, the lack of reinvestments in jobs, capital mobility, there has not been enough investment in roles for people. And there's a huge amount of investment and sacrifice that has been made by people searching for the possibility of their position. The thing is, in terms of psychoanalysis, it's not just to say that it's only operating at the level of this kind of like subjectival, transcendent, quote unquote, question, because it always takes place in the material world. We are material subjects, but we have this relationship to the material world that is deviated and irrational because we are self-conscious beings. My mum always says we used to have this rabbit that was capable of eating just to its fill, right? It just, she'd be like, oh, we all need to take a lesson from Tonka because we give it just the amount of money and it never overeats. So he's so sensible, such a slim man. Oh, God. Of course, humans are completely different from this because humans can't eat. We can't eat. We have to have rituals around eating. We eat too much. We eat too less. Food signifies more than itself. If we think about the signifier apple, it is not just an apple that we eat. It is the fall of Adam and Eve. It is the egregious corporation that doesn't pay tax. It is the big apple. It is an apple a day keeps the doctor away. It's all these different things to the human subject because of language. So this does all take place, though we are material animals, but there's always a deviation between material reality and the experience we have as subjects. But capitalism plays upon this deviation, and psychoanalysis at its best gets us to confront the status of subjectivity as divided and as it relates to material reality. And in Freud's words, allows us to sort of come to an ordinary unhappiness where we're able to confront and tarry with the lack that is ourselves. Materially, there is a question of if this were able to play out on both a subjectival and a collective way, would this allow us to disinvest from capitalist bourgeois ideology in a certain way? Marx potentially points towards this in the introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, where he's talking about picking the living flower. And I see the living flower and Freud's ordinary unhappiness in a similar way. So you have this image of the opium of the people, the human subject being in chains. So we're in chains, but the chains are decorated with flowers, ersatz flowers, not real ones. These are the ideological investments, our investment in the ideology of promise, which mystifies our material reality. Our job as Marxists is to take away those flowers, to confront the chains, which will be difficult to break, but which must be broken in order to pick the living flower. So the living flower exists in reality itself. Maybe that's kind of like a really long-winded, and I don't know if I touched upon what we were talking about, but that's part of the argument.
No, it's really useful because I just realized I was thinking, oh no, how is this different from mindfulness? Like if only people could get back in touch with something and you have mindful, if only consumers could be more mindful, they would realize that they don't need, and then I thought, is that what we're doing here? Are we really, because in my book I talk about like a lot of these ideologies are like first promote X something solution to social, like this intractable social problem. Like we haven't been able to deal with like the end of capitalism. We've been unsuccessful over and over. It's like, well, what we really need is we need to first promote this thing. Then somehow, some way, we'll overcome the problem. So it's like, first we need to promote self-esteem, and then women will have the self-efficacy to stand up to men. And then first we need to promote mindfulness, and then people will disengage from the ideology of cap. But I do the same thing. And this worries me now. I had just realized it. That I'm saying, like, I get annoyed with people using these therapeutic ideologies to kind of drop out, right? Mm-hmm. They're like, they feel this anxiety, right? This like, something missing in the world, this lack of meaning, this void, and they feel the pressure of the neoliberal taking over of every minute of your life. So it all has to be, I can't sit still for a second. That's the way that I am, and then I try to take a day off and I feel guilty and this sort of thing. And then I just burn out, right? That's everybody. And then you feel like, I just don't want to do anything. And maybe doing nothing is a kind of resistance in itself, right? Or you want to kind of drop out, or you develop a diagnosis that gives a name or a label to how you're feeling. And then you can find your meaning in that because it comes to the whole list of behaviors and da-da-da. And so you find yourself. And how am I not doing that? How are we not doing that? What I meant to say here is, how am I not also saying, oh, if we just did away with all this nonsense, somehow, some way, we would truly be able to see our way out of capitalism? But Helen gives an interesting response to this idea that I kind of got lost in, which is avoidance of responsibility and how we get stuck in this kind of void and engage in this bad faith justification for that dropping out.
We are all part. This is the thing that's absolutely, because there is no personal responsibility. This is, this, and also this is a perfect conundrum in a sense. So Freud, it's no coincidence that psychoanalysis and film sort of have been associated culturally and academically. They arise at similar points in time. So Freud discovers the unconscious in like the 1890s. The first films are developed by the Lumiere brothers and Leon in like the 1890s as well. And the structure of cinema happens to, in terms of its material development at that period of time, it happens to adopt a structure, especially through Hollywood, which accords with a specific capitalist ideology. This sort of Hollywood narrative where a subject who contingently is missing something goes on a quest to be fulfilled. I actually argue in this book that it is precisely this structure that offers the emancipatory potential within cinema. It's not the we are so clever, capitalism stupid, we can overcome it by just having these still poetic fragmented narratives. It's precisely that moment in capitalism that can allow us to confront our subjectivity in a certain way, precisely because, as Hegel points out, each order of society represses the contradiction in different ways.
The Green Ray is a 1986 film that confronts the viewer with the alienation its protagonist, Delphine, experiences in relation to her own desire. After a breakup, Delphine is left alone in Paris, whilst the city empties for the month of August. Multiple friends and family members offer Delphine different options. She is paralyzed by the multiplicity of the offers and, free to choose, is confused by what she wants. Delphine goes from one holiday to the next in Cherbourg, the Alps, Biarritz, finding herself constantly dissatisfied by the contingent factors that do not seem to hold up against an unarticulated perfect holiday she imagines she might enjoy. In the final part of the film, Delphine overhears an elderly man discussing a meteorological phenomenon, a rare flash of green that occurs on the horizon at sunset. According to the Jules Verne novel of the same name, if one catches the green light and gazes into it, one understands one's desires and sees the thoughts of those close by. Captured by the mystery and promise of the green ray, Delphine takes a man she has just met to wait for the green ray at sunset. Together, they witness it. She experiences a brief moment of excitement, but the question as to whether she will receive the answer to her desire remains unresolved. The viewer, having identified with Delphine's desire throughout the film, is let down in their expectation of closure along with her, a process that is analogous in the longer term to the cure in psychoanalysis.
Capitalism manages it in a way that's particularly egregious and anxiety-producing to the human subject, because it is so badly denied by a system that obviously fails, but that religiously draws us in a certain way. And this antagonism causes subjective suffering. And this is why Freud it was really bourgeois subjects that he was encountering in the clinic, people who had these symptoms that were to do with an inability to tarry with the contradictions of capitalism. And today, one of the greatest satisfactions is, I'm Freudian slipping all over this place, but whatever, dissatisfaction. is the way in which we're promised that we exist in a meritocracy when so obviously we do not. So psychoanalysis there is a question of the fact that like all of this stuff is very obvious to a lot of people who are just working and see capitalism for what it is. There is also a question today of the role of the worker in terms of how Marx pointed out that this subject can offer a means of confronting capitalism, controlling supply chains, all this kind of thing. When we are exploited in a way that is totally mystified, as capitalism mystifies more and more, what ability do we have, not even ascending to workers? For instance, if we look at the way that even with this podcast, right, and this is the issue with critique, and the other argument I kind of make in this book, and this is a Lacanian point related to the point that you're making in terms of the analyst discourse. There is no offer of solution anywhere in the analyst discourse. The analyst discourse is a confrontation with contradiction. And one of the key passages in Lacan's writing is to do with the contradiction of desire. So this example shows how Lacan is neither a utopian capitalist in terms of you can be fulfilled in your desire, or a reactionary conservative who does the sort of quietist, I'm not even, I'm going to take command of my desire in order to prevent myself from being disappointed or something like that. And we can see, all these different ways that on a micro level, we try to manage the contradictions of capitalism, like mindfulness and stuff. Mindfulness, can we say, is a sort of, has its own reactionariness in it. I think we've talked a lot about how where today a lot of apparently emancipatory or liberatory positions are perhaps the most reactionary right wing, if we look at it on a more subjectival kind of level. But in terms of this dictum on desire, so Lacan says that one should not give grounds in terms of one's desire. In a sense, there's not a very good way of translating this, because in the French, it's structured in a certain way. And he uses the word give ground, or we can translate it as yield. So the idea is that if you think of a stop sign with a car, yield. In one way, if you yield to your desire and you see your desire as your desire passing you by, you yield to it, you give way, you let it go. So on the one hand, you can interpret this phrase as one should not let one's desire pass one by. So like, I don't know, someone like a nun who doesn't engage in the complex and contradictory adult life of being a sexual subject. You withdraw and you let the desire pass you by. And in a sense, this is also maybe nuns in a specific way, but this reactionary absolution way of dealing with desire is part of capitalist ideology and capitalist logic. And in fact, it's interesting, we can see the way that conservative cultures throughout history have tried to deal with the antagonism of desire. And there is a promise itself in absolution, in retreating from desire, in retreating from being a human adult political subject who must tarry with the fact that one desires and everybody else desires differently, precisely because of the structure of subjectivity. Being an adult and being a political subject is navigating that. On the other side, and this is where Lacan is critical of movements like the 1968 student movements, the rise of what would become neoliberalism, which is just as you should not yield like a car in a stop sign, let it pass you by, you shouldn't yield as in give yourself over to the promise and fulfillment of your desire. Either way, so utopian neoliberal capitalism, post-68, one of the slogans that came out of 1968 was jouir sans entrave, which is enjoy without borders. So just go for your desire and get the fulfillment. Of course, because of the reasons we've explained, and go into much greater detail on how this materially occurs at the level of subjectivity, you will never be absolved. You cannot be absolved. So neoliberal capitalism promises an assuagement and doesn't offer it. There are all sorts of different ways in which we are alienated as capitalist subjects, not least just economically in terms of labor, et cetera, but also in terms of the promise that's offered us even when we do get what we want, because we can never be fulfilled in the way that we are promised. So basically, yeah, he doesn't offer, there's no solution either way. So as soon as you have, in a sense, everything is capitalist and nothing is capitalist. Capitalism itself is like the structure of no structure. It is what has emerged when what Hegel calls the bad infinite of our desire is just given free rein in terms of the economic system. I know I listened to you yesterday on something else, and I totally agree with you that the solution is not like, and in many ways, communism, especially a mode of communism as it's sort of malinterpreted in a utopian way from Marx, is the very dream of capitalism. And the more we invest in the utopian dream, the more capitalism we get. So mindfulness can be the most capitalist thing, and often is. And as soon as we have the predominance of therapy culture, as soon as it's brought into the workplace, and as soon as it's offered as a promise, it's completely within the capitalist mode of being. So it's not necessarily like the what, but the why or the how potentially. But just
and what it becomes as well once it gets bound up in all of that, because what it was is quite different from what it actually is, what it is in the real world, and what it might be ideally. And people will often say, oh, well, no, that's not real mindfulness. Well, that's the one you're going to get. That's the one that has such an ideological takeover in terms of policy, that sort of thing. But anyway, sorry, go on.
I was going to say that absolutely right. It's like you have the psychoanalysis you want, and the psychoanalysis you're going to get as an undergraduate in the neoliberal university. It's like you have the Marx you want, and then the Marx you're going to get. So and this is why it's really difficult to talk about, because it's to do with a positionality relative to, in psychoanalytic terms, the possibility of fulfillment and desire. But as capitalism spreads further and further and further, I mean, how much capitalism, when people say, I mean, obviously Frederick Jameson has just died, but late stage capitalism, from a Hegelian perspective, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk. We don't know when late is. We still we're not quite charged for the air we breathe yet. Obviously, in some parts of the world you are. But we are seeing a process of the commoditization of everything, most especially subjectivity today through social media. And this makes it more and more and more and more difficult to get a grip on what we're dealing with in terms of the structure of our economy. And a lot of people talk about, the 19th century subject in relation to Marx and what was possible on a political front because of the way that people related to the system. Today, precisely because the ideology of capitalism, which is the promise of oneness in fulfillment, if it's interpreted in a certain direction, in terms of the ideology, obviously it's meted out materially in our system of exchange and the extraction of surplus value. So this is not at all a denial of that material structure. This is a question of how, in terms of subjectivity, we relate to that system and how that system comes about related to that system, and why it's so difficult for us to get a grip of that system. But it's so difficult to think outside of this. And it's funny because obviously we have this predominance today of calling everybody a Nazi. And it's obviously like a really silly thing to do. But on the other hand, and again, this is maybe the critical theory you want versus the critical theory you're going to get, capitalism puts you in a position where it's really hard to think outside of a philosophical dynamic or an ideological dynamic, not the same as Middle European 20th century, early 20th century, a specific political form, but in terms of the philosophical underlying dynamic that underpinned that ideology, which was a utopian logic whereby a perfect world, a perfect society exists. It cannot exist because of the divided nature of the universe itself. And what will always happen in a utopian mindset, which is the logic of capitalism, the promise of oneness and fulfillment, which cannot ever arrive, is you have to erect contingent enemies, problems behind which the utopian reality is cast in a shadow, if only you can get rid of that bad thinker or bad person. And we might not be in a world where yet, we do live in a world where people are, but the Nazi Germany is a very specific thing. But the desire to erect enemies and dehumanize them and have them as the contingent reason why we do not have the perfect universe that capitalist utopianism promises us is a dynamic that we all engage in. And it happens to be the same underlying dynamic as the one that underpinned Nazism in a really egregious way. And I think this is partly why you get this really annoyed response when people use this term Nazi, because often it's precisely the culture itself that leads somebody to call somebody a Nazi in 2024, even though there are people who, a certain number, probably quite few throughout the world, who do identify as actual Nazis. It's so egregious because it precisely, the underlying unconscious dynamic is the same capitalist utopianism that has to erect contingent enemies behind whom you can imagine that a perfect world exists if it wasn't for that contingent obstacle or enemy.
Yeah, the thing that capitalism, it makes these promises, and it also doesn't make these promises, and that's in some ways what it has ideologically over communism. Because in really existing socialism, right, if you like try to feed people and you fail, you're the worst monster in the universe because now you've starved people. Whereas if you like export all the food and people starve, it's like, whoops, it was there's no one, because you never promise to feed anybody, right? So or like it has such a centralized place for subjectivity in the sense of like the citizen, that when things go wrong, you have no one to blame but yourself, and no one to blame but the human beings who did the wrong thing. And in that sense, it's exactly Nazism. Nazism is this paradigmatic ideology of capitalism. I know I'm going crazy now, typical leftist, but it is, because it also centers the human so much. It centers it's a misanthropology that explains why things go wrong, right? So look, things wouldn't be so wrong, is exactly what you're saying, if not for these people, right? Because that's it, that's all you have. Whereas like a systems theory is much more difficult to understand, but at least displaces the centrality of the subject, except in terms of why things go wrong, except in terms of trying to actually make that be right, make what capitalism claims to be true actually be true, in the sense that capitalism says that subjects determine everything. We want a world in which subjects determine everything, which is also terrifying, really scary, and I think accounts for a lot of the turnoffs we take. We should take control of the world. We know that that's our duty as humanity. And then you look back at the 20th century and all the bodies piling up, and you're like, maybe tomorrow. Today we'll meditate.
Well, this is
Visit patreon.com/Ashley A. Frawley for part 2.